Hello, friends. If you're anything like me, you've seen something like this in the store and thought to yourself, I could make that. Well, you're right, you can. And today I'm going to show you how to make this children's-sized bookcase. This is a pretty simple, easy build, really only requiring some basic tools. This bookcase is the perfect addition to any kid's room. It has the space on the bottom for those awkward things like those book sets, or of course you can put toys down there. The top allows for all the books to be facing forward so they're easy to see and easy to access. And then these rails keep the books in place and prevent them from falling out. This really is the perfect bookcase for those little readers. And if you'd like to make this, I have some build plans available in the link in the description below, and that will make this project really quick and easy for you. So, let's get started.
For this project, I'm going with MDF because it takes paint really well, and I had a bunch lying around. And this project actually uses a lot of pretty thin pieces, which is perfect for some of those offcuts you might have. So after cutting them into some more manageable pieces, I went ahead and labeled them, and then it's time to rip them to their final widths on the table saw. Or would it be better to call it the height? I don't know. Either way, you can probably tell what I'm doing here. In my build plans for the cut list, I suggest using a 4x8 sheet of 3/4 inch MDF, but really you could use whatever is easiest for you or whatever you might have lying around. The important thing is that you're using 3/4 inch thick MDF. Also, if you don't want to paint this project, you could go with a more natural look and use some plywood. Just make sure if you do that, you use some edge banding on any exposed edges. That just gives it a more finished look. And then you could stain it, or not, doesn't matter too much, but finish it with some sort of polyurethane or a lacquer. That'll give it a nice durable finish. So after cutting everything to the proper height on the table saw, it's time to move over to the miter saw and cut everything to the exact width or length. Again, I don't know, use those terms interchangeably in my head. And then once I have that done, I have all of my pieces ready for the next steps. So now I'm going to measure and cut the curved piece for the front of the bookcase. This is completely optional. You could easily just do one extra piece that's 1 inch tall, but I do think this curved piece gives it a nice look and just adds a little interesting visual element. For any exposed edges or touch points, I'm going to use this 1/8 inch radius roundover bit on the router table, and that's just going to make them smooth and soft to the touch. You could just as easily accomplish this same task with a sander, or even just doing it by hand with some sandpaper. It really doesn't take a lot to knock down these corners on some MDF. And I promise you this extra step is completely worth it, and again, it's just one of those little touches that gives your project a more professional finish. Now I'm going to measure and lay out the lines for where I'm going to cut the corner off of those two side pieces. My build plans have the exact measurements for where you're going to want to do this. So again, if you want to build this project and support my little channel at the same time, you can pick up the build plans in the link in the description below. It will just save you a whole lot of time not having to figure out any of the measurements or how to assemble this project. I would really appreciate it, but if you feel comfortable making this without any build plans, go right ahead. That really is one of the best ways to learn and grow as a woodworker. Or in this case, an MDF worker. But don't be ashamed that you're using MDF. This is a great product for this type of project. Especially one that's going to be painted, and let's be honest, probably take a pretty good beating from some toddlers. But that's enough sales pitchiness. Let's get back to your regularly scheduled, inspirational woodworking MDF build video. So now I'm going to make some lines to cut a dado in these side pieces. In my build plans, this base is attached with some pocket screws, but I just kind of wanted to do a different technique here for this video. And just show you guys how you can do a dado with a router, because sometimes you will need to be able to do that skill. So I make one line where I want my dado to be, and then another line, two because I messed up, where I want my guide to be. And this is just the distance between my router bit and the spacer on the router. Oh, nice. Time for everybody's favorite part of woodworking, sanding with the hand sander. So I'm just going to be sanding all of the exposed edges. MDF can be pretty porous, so this will help make the surface smoother and take the paint better. If you're using MDF, do not skip this step. You'll just have a bunch of weird little holes on the edges of your boards. And just to be clear, this is just the edges of the MDF that will be painted, not the flat surfaces. You don't need to sand those. For assembly, I'm going to be using my Craig pocket hole jig. I will put a link in the description below for this item that I use. It's a smaller one, but it works great for most purposes. And when I'm drilling all of these pocket holes, they are all done so with the plan in mind. They are all going to be in specific spots, for one, so that they are not exposed and you can't see them, and two, so that when it comes to assembly, that the pocket holes are not in a weird spot that I can't really access with my driver. There's also a specific Craig clamp that you would want to use with this pocket hole jig, so I will link that in the description below as well. Drilling pocket holes on these really narrow pieces can be a little challenging, but if you just put two of them together and clamp them both together, you can actually drill them both at the same time without having to readjust your jig. This is the part on the build plans where I go with the easier route of using pocket holes to assemble these parts, but for me I'm going to go ahead and use the wood glue and slide in my base to these dados that I cut earlier into the side pieces. And I'm just going to clamp it up while the glue dries, and then for the top I'm going to use some of the other parts that I have as spacers just so that the whole unit is square. Now I'm ready to assemble the shelving for the books. There's not a whole lot here that's too complicated, but I am just going to use a lot of clamps to make the job easier, and then I'm going to drill some pilot holes for the wood screws and some countersink holes for the wood screws. And if you're wondering why I can't do both of those at the same time, it's because the bit for my countersink bit has broken and I just haven't replaced it. And let's be honest here, I'm a woodworker, and woodworker is often synonymous with hoarder, so even if I went out and bought a new countersink drill bit set, I would probably just keep the broken ones I have anyways because, well, you just never know when you might need it. So here I am, using a broken countersink drill bit set. So just repeat that exact same process one more time on this project, and then my assembly will get a little more complicated, but not very much so. Just follow along and you'll be fine. So because I want there to be a little lip where the books sit so they don't just slide out the front, this next piece where the books are going to be resting needs to be a little bit below the edge, so I can't just attach these two edges together. So to account for that, I'm going to draw a line 1 inch down from this edge, and that will be the line where my board will be attached at. Placing in place now. That looks good. Putting some clamps on off screen. That looks good. And now I'm going to be using those pocket holes that I drilled earlier. And you can see how these pocket holes are going to be on the underneath and backside, so you won't ever see them. Now I'm just going to repeat all of those same steps until this assembly is completely done. It's looking pretty good. Real quick, get those front and back support pieces attached with those pocket screws. And this project is basically ready for paint. But wait, it's actually not. I forgot something I wanted to do. Now this step is completely unnecessary, but this finish is just something I had my heart set on, so I kind of have to do it. I meant to cut some rabbets in these boards that will be the back, so that I could do the backer piece sort of inset with the bookcase. I could have just as easily cut the backer board to fit within the bookcase exactly and then attach it with pocket screws, which is actually what the build plans call for, but I had wanted to try this, and now I've just made my life a whole lot more difficult, so I'm going to have to make a makeshift router setup to cut these rabbets on an already assembled piece. Of course, I also could have just used an 1/8 inch thick hardboard backer for the back of the bookcase, but again, I just kind of had tunnel vision on a specific way that I wanted to attach this backer board. But that's the funny thing about making mistakes in woodworking. I would have never thought of doing this, but using this double-sided tape to create almost a fence on the router actually seemed to work okay, and it might be something I use in the future. So do I regret the gigantic mess it made? Yeah, but hey, at least I learned something. And I was able to accomplish a task without the use of a router edge guide, which would have made this a lot easier, but I don't have one. And though the back looks pretty sloppy because of my router setup here, you will see how I was intending to have it attached. So now I'm going to cut the backer board, and it doesn't have to be terribly precise because of the rabbets that I made for where I'm going to be attaching this piece. And the reason I wanted it attached this way is mostly because I didn't want to be able to see the thin backer board if I went that route in the back of the bookcase. And as far as not doing the inset backer board, attaching it with some pocket screws, well, I had just kind of wanted to try a different technique here. And in the end, it came out looking really nice. One last step before painting, and that is to attach the base trim. This isn't absolutely necessary, but it does give it a more finished look. The piece I got was a little bit larger than the height I needed, so I ripped it to the size on the table saw, and then I went ahead and attached it with brad nails. On the front, I did wood glue just so I didn't have any nail holes to fill. And the piece that I found was actually already primed, so that saved me one small little step. But again, you can find any sort of base trim you want. It doesn't really matter too much as long as it fits the style that you're going for. For any woodworking project that's going to be painted, I recommend using Benjamin Moore Advanced Paint. This is a really hard, durable paint. And this is really the same kind of paint that you could use on any sort of kitchen cabinets, built-ins, or any other project like that. So it's going to work great for me here as well. Probably the best feature about this Benjamin Moore Advanced Paint is the self-leveling properties. What this means is that the paint basically levels itself, and that greatly reduces any sort of brush or roller streaks. And this can be applied with a sprayer or with a brush and roll like I'm doing here, though applying with a brush and a roller there are a few techniques you'll want to make sure you do that I will get to in a few minutes when I apply my top coats. For now though, I'm just applying the advanced primer to the whole project. For a small project like this, it's really just not worth it to me to get out the sprayer. It's far too messy, and it actually probably really isn't even any faster, just because of all the time that goes into setup and cleanup with the sprayer. With any woodworking project, the finish you choose and how you go about applying it and the care that you take in doing so really can make or break that project. And with painting your projects, the same still applies. So it really is imperative that you take all of the necessary steps to get the best finish possible. So with that in mind, if you'd like a high quality professional painted finish to your project, here's a step that you absolutely must do after you've applied your primer coat and before you apply your top coats of paint. So what you want to do is lightly sand all of the painted surfaces on your entire project. I'm using 220 here, and you can see how the dust comes off after I've sanded it. And then what I'm going to go ahead and do is use a tack cloth to get all of that loose dust and any other debris that's just on the surface of my project. This is what gives you a nice smooth feel to your project. And when it comes to your top coats of paint, you're going to want to do at least 2 coats of paint, maybe 3 depending on your color of paint. But for these light colors, I find 2 is plenty sufficient. And here's the technique that I mentioned earlier you want to make sure you're doing when you're using a brush or a roller with this paint. You're going to want to paint horizontal or side to side on your workpiece, and then you're going to want to apply more paint in the opposite direction, up and down. And what this does, it gives a nice crisscross to all of the paint to allow those self-leveling properties to really take effect. So after 2 coats of advanced semi-gloss paint, no sanding between coats, you can see that I have a nice smooth finish that has a really nice gloss to it. To start my assembly, I'm going to use these spacers attached to the sides, and this will be to hold up the book shelving portion of my bookcase. This just gives me a surface to rest my book shelving on while I'm clamping and putting the fasteners in. And it also serves the purpose of making sure that my shelving is perfectly straight and even on both sides. I'm also going to use a bunch of spacers and clamps to put my book rails in. The use of spacers and clamps really help prevent errors when it comes to assembly and lining up your parts. And the use of clamps here is basically a necessity so you can keep all of your parts in place and prevent them from moving while you're driving in your fasteners. Here's what the bookcase looks like from the back. You can see all the clamps doing their job holding everything in place, and you can see a whole lot of pocket holes ready for pocket screws. And because I did so much advanced planning and prep work before getting to this step, this last part of driving in the fasteners and attaching these pieces is basically foolproof. It's really just a matter of find hole, put screw through it. No thought required. Getting these screws in for the rails with the regular driver can be a little cumbersome, though it can be done, but because I have a right angle attachment for a driver, I'm going to go ahead and use that, and it definitely makes this part a lot easier. And I will put an Amazon link to this product in the description below if you want to pick one of these up. It's one of those tools you don't need very often, but when you need it, it comes in super handy. And as always, disclaimer, any link that you do follow and make a purchase through on Amazon does help support this channel, so I do appreciate that. So sometimes clamps can leave some stains behind, so I just wanted to show you how easy these are to clean on this paint. Just spray with some regular water, wipe off, and any staining is gone. One last step, which is always very exciting, is to attach this back panel. You'll notice it doesn't go all the way to the top, as that wouldn't be necessary at all. If you do happen to purchase the plans for this, you'll see that the options I have laid out in there are different than what I'm doing here. Whether you choose an 1/8 inch piece of hardboard just attached to the edges, or you do an inset piece of 3/4 inch MDF attached with pocket holes, the final results will still basically be the same, and whichever one you choose, it's still going to look great.